So this month, as we celebrate the 30th anniversary of wolves being reintroduced to Montana and Idaho, we have two incredible journalists joining us today who collaborated on a fantastic story, really documenting those first initial years of the reintroduction and a little bit afterwards, but mostly in the throes of how this big venture started. And it's truly a must read. So anybody that's listening, please go and check that out, and we'll give you all the descriptions for it. But it was a combination of WyoFile and the Montana Free Press. So from WyoFile, we have our friend Mike Koshmrl back with us. We've had him on a couple times. And introducing Amanda Eggert from the Montana Free Press. Nice to have you on for the first time. How are you guys doing?
Doing well, thanks. Thanks for having us on.
Doing great.
Yeah.
Good to be back here, John.
Totally. Amanda, let's start with you because this is your first introduction to our listeners and the community here. Just give everybody a little bit of a background. I know you've been reporting for quite some time. You've been with the Montana Free Press since 2021, but you've done a lot of freelance work. You've worked with Explore Yellowstone, Mountain Outlaw, Explore Big Sky. Where did journalism fall for you sort of early on, and why so much in the environmental space for you as you've gone on in your career?
Yeah, well, I've loved writing since I was young. I've kept journals since I was like 8 years old or something. And I really was drawn to journalism because it gave me an opportunity. It still gives me an opportunity to learn things every day and to be out in the world talking to people. And I have a strong love for all things outdoors. Growing up in Montana, I think that's kind of a common theme for a lot of folks, but I really wanted to make sure that that I was writing on the environmental issues that have implications for this place that I love so much. So that's kind of what drew me to environmental reporting.
What's been something leading up to this story that you were working on that's really, like you said, the environmental issues that touch close to you that you've really been passionate about, and the things you've been working on leading up to this this collaboration?
Oh boy. Yeah, I mean, one of the things that has just really stuck with me about wildlife management and wolves in particular is this idea of it being something that's a high conflict kind of issue, which is it's like you mentioned the word wolf and you can kind of see people's blood pressure spike a little bit. And it's an interesting issue for that reason, because it's like it's one of those things where people seem to have a position going, right out of the gate. And so I think that makes it for a fascinating issue to cover as a journalist.
Mike, for you, because we've had you on a couple times already talking about the wolf issue in Wyoming and in other places. How did you approach this story in particular? Because this isn't necessarily I guess as Amanda was saying, it's not one of those like controversial issues because it's something that already happened. So it's really just going back into it. What was that process like for you going into something like this as opposed to doing an investigative report and doing the research that you would normally do?
Yeah, so the Montana Free Press approached WyoFile about doing some kind of collaboration. I've been a journalist in Wyoming for 12 years, so I've been through two of the previous 5-year anniversaries, 20 and 25. And like, just to be frank, like I was like initially not that interested. Anniversary stories just kind of, I don't know, it's like a little bit of fluff. And but we had a meeting and went into it with an open mind. And it was actually Brad, Amanda's boss, who pitched kind of a concept that I thought was intriguing, where we would do like an oral history where like rather than the brunt of the writing being like our kind of digestion of what happened and doing, interviews and interspersing quotes, it would be like essentially the product would be like the memories of people that lived it. And I just thought that was really compelling, something I've never done as a journalist, just a project. And so that was attractive to me. And just I was a history major dating back to college days. And so it just seemed like a cool approach. And we rolled with it.
Nice.
You guys interviewed these folks for this publication, or you pulled from previous quotes and documents?
Yeah, everyone incorporated in the piece we interviewed. It was fun to like go back and read some that had been published before, and I did read like for Ed Bangs, I read a quote from a High Country News piece from a while back to him, and that was kind of fun to see if anything had changed in his thinking about that particular piece of the article in High Country News.
Yeah, we kind of
It is.
brainstormed just like a list. Actually, before we put names to it, I think some of them were just names, but we also just like we wanted to get like someone from the livestock industry. You know, we wanted people in state government. We wanted people, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, who were involved in kind of the bureaucracy of it. And then, like, after I think we kind of consulted with some of the sources about like who would be best fit this, generated quite a list of people. Probably twice as many people as we ended up talking to around a joint spreadsheet we had going. And honestly, there were like there were still people that we could have added on top. I actually had a number of emails after the story published. People like, you should have talked to this person. I'm like, yes, I should have. I wish we could have, but just kind of constraints and had to cut ourselves off.
Yeah, it's always talk about that process. Amanda, I'll go to you, and then Mike, if you have anything to add on top, just about bringing in all of these voices, because it was an oral history. And I love that about the piece, is that it was it was actually a quick read for me, because you're seeing what these people are saying about, as opposed to, like you said, fully writing this. But what's that like, making those calls, people, revisiting this event that happened 30 years ago and trying to make it a little bit more of a fresh approach, as opposed to, as Mike maybe alluded to, doing another anniversary piece, 20 years, 25 years. What makes this a little bit different for somebody that you'd reach out to?
Yeah, it was a lot of fun. And it was kind of interesting too, as you could probably expect for some of our interviewees. Details were a little bit fuzzy, specific numbers, days were a little bit fuzzy. And for others, they just had very vivid, visceral recollections of 1995 and 1996 that they could speak to. And I think it was, it's really interesting, because in that kind of an oral history project, the kinds of memories that are kind of poignant, but maybe not super like policy oriented, are the kinds of memories and pieces of story that would get cut out of different kinds of tellings and different kinds of news stories, because they would be seen as peripheral, or, just not quite going to the heart of the issue that we're talking about. And I thought it was kind of fun to incorporate some of those details in a way that you wouldn't necessarily have in a more traditional telling.
Absolutely. What about you, Mike? Anything that stuck out to you as you were getting all these people together?
One cool aspect I thought was, I think we ended up talking to some people that have not so much been in the spotlight. So like, some of them are, and they're like quite, have like very public facing persona. That Doug Smith just retired. He's all over the place. And Mike Phillips, his state legislature, involved in Colorado reintroduction, all over the place. Ed Baines is still pretty, I read his name here or there in publications. But some of the other people we ended up talking to, I think it's just like maybe perspectives that have been a little bit lost. Amanda talked to former Montana governor, Mark, I'm going to say his last name wrong, but Roscoe, doesn't look like it, but it is. And I talked to a guy, Steve Fritz, who is like kind of the like bureaucrat scientist at U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, who kind of like devised what the reintroduction would actually look like where you get the wolves, how, just like the logistical things. And he's just someone who's been in the background, I think, for the last 30 years, and people hadn't reached out to. So I think it was cool for him to be able to dig back into his memory bank, now that he's in his 70s and well retired.
Yeah, I agree with that too. I think just bringing more voices to the forefront. Did either of you, Amanda, I'll start with you. Did you get any pushback from anybody who you tried to reach out to, who maybe, and you don't have to name names, but just was there anybody who was like, nah, I've already done this and done this 100 times. I don't really want to relive it. Or what was the general feeling that both of you got as you were reaching out and sort of putting this history together? And on top of that, once you got your collective people that you spoke to, how do you start piecing something like that together? Because like you said, it's a little bit different than just writing the piece out and then putting these quotes together to form this beautiful long form story.
Yeah. Well, folks were actually quite receptive. I think we started with a list of, we're going to reach out to, I think it was around like 15 people, and we'll plan on incorporating about 10. And then we decided on 12 ultimately. The only person who I reached out to that wasn't up for being interviewed, perhaps because he just had a lot going on at the time, was Senator John Tester, who is just about to be leaving the U.S. Senate. He didn't. His spokesperson didn't explain necessarily why he wasn't interested in being interviewed. Senator John Tester was responsible for the wolf delisting rider that was added to an appropriations bill that achieved delisting. So his perspective would have been interesting to incorporate. But he's the only person who gave me a hard no. And then the other folks that I interviewed, there was one individual in particular who was a little bit media shy. He wouldn't let me take a photo of him. He kept kind of pushing me towards other people who were involved. And that was kind of interesting to navigate too, but he ultimately was very helpful and receptive.
Wow. How long did it take from start to finish to get all this information? I'm still looking through it, and it's just an incredible amount of people and information.
Yeah, we started we were having like weekly calls kind of to keep ourselves on track, because these big project stories, it's easy to just not do anything on them. So the calls were helpful. I would guess 2 to 3 months in advance we were scheming.
Yeah, I'd say about a month of planning, about a month of interviewing, and then a month of like putting it all together, editing, finally.
I mean, it seems like there's a theme or a thread throughout many of the interviews that, even as they recognize the level of contention or vitriol that would come with doing this, they just kind of kept going. Even as the realization set in that it would be hard to change minds and personal threats, et cetera, they just kept it moving. Was that a theme that you were cognizant of as you were writing this article, or is it just a coincidental through line?
Yeah, we talked about emphasizing what you're pointing out, because it certainly wasn't common to all of the interviewees, but a big chunk of them certainly were surprised or disappointed in that kind of like the wolf management has become so political and so much vitriol, as you to use your word, to this day. So we did kind of strategically emphasize that, like that feeling from many of the interviewees as the story wrapped up.
What else do you got? Yeah, anything else, Amanda, that stuck out for you, that, or like any through lines other than that, or what else did you have?
I think that there was optimism at the start of reintroduction that familiarity would breed a little more comfort from folks who were concerned about wolf reintroduction. And virtually everyone who spoke to that theme said, man, we were wrong. It didn't end up. I guess Mark Roscoe, former Montana governor, is an outlier in that regard. But wildlife biologists that we spoke with said, we thought maybe that over time, with more familiarity and with maybe a hunting season, like maybe these things would help kind of turn down the dial on the debate a little bit. And many of them were surprised at the degree to which that has not seemed to happen. Yeah,
it definitely is something that has obviously been talked about for decades now. So now that since first paws hit the ground, it seems like it's been this overarching theme. As you guys you said obviously there's a ton of prep going into a story like this, and it's a well thought out and a well detailed read. Mike, when you guys are sitting, when you and Amanda or maybe your other colleagues are sitting here or having these phone calls, what's the strategy to make sure that this story flows the way that both of you intended to? Because you can have the through lines you want, but how long is that process to find the specific quote that'll continue the storyline all the way down this page? Clearly that must be a little bit of time consumption. Was there any, I don't want to say any joy, but was that an interesting part for either of you to go through all this testimony, meaning like just recapping everything that happened? How was that process for you guys?
We kind of did it collectively. We dumped our favorite things people said into a document and then went through that and dumped it into a shared document and tried to trim it down together, and a lot of cutting. I mean, yeah, certainly took time, and that's not a normal approach to how you kind of glued together a story, or I had never done that, at least.
What about you, Amanda? Anything that sort of came up for you in any of the recalls, any of the moments and stuff like that as you were sifting through it all?
I mean, there were some pieces in the interviews that didn't make it into the final piece because it was just a little bit too peripheral, but there are some really powerful things that people said. Something that I think will stick with me for a long time came from Ed Bangs. He was the gray wolf recovery coordinator for U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, basically from prior to the reintroduction all the way to delisting. So really, long tenure of wolf management. He said that it wasn't until agriculture hit the scene and people started raising animals that wolves were seen as an animal to be feared and killed. Prior to that, there wasn't this kind of acrimonious sort of relationship between wolves and humans. And I'm not sure necessarily what he's basing that on, but I had never contemplated that before. And that was really interesting.
Yeah, I mean, looking at the story too, and I hear you because it's these different lenses that people look at things through. Obviously, there's the ag sector and there's livestock and management and biology and ecology. It's all these things that we try to interweave into any of the podcasts that we do to give the whole picture and not just the singular focus on the animal. One thing I love that you guys added in there, both of you, is to have the native voice in there. I saw John Potter was strewn throughout, and he's been such an advocate, and he was there on the ground. How important is it to make sure that those individuals and those tribes are recognized for their contribution? Because when people were posting about it, I spoke to somebody on Instagram who messaged us on the podcast. It was like, don't forget the Nez Perce were very, very at the forefront in Idaho as opposed to Montana. So how was that? Was that something going in to make sure that, like you said, Mike, you hit all these different points? I'm sure they were one of them.
Yeah, that was, when we were doing kind of the brainstorming about sources, we certainly wanted to have an Indigenous voice. And there were like other categories of people. I remember at one point when we had quite a few interviews nailed down, and it like dawned on us, I think we only had one woman, so we actively found another one. Just to provide some diversity in the story and viewpoints and world experiences. And
what was interesting about John Potter and Scott Fraser is that, they weren't really involved in the planning or the actual execution of the plan. They were really interested to see how it all happened, right? And they were just really invested in wolf restoration and continue to be. They both go to the park regularly, and I think honoring wolves is a fundamental reason for their annual visits there.
When you guys take a step back from the piece itself, I'll start with you, man, and then go to Mike. Did you have any initial thoughts or a synopsis of what you wanted this story to look like as opposed to what it ultimately came out to be? And I don't know let me know if that makes sense or not. So when you go in, you say, we'd love for this to look like X, but in reality, once we put it all together, it looks like Y. Was there anything that you saw, or maybe like you said, there were some things left on the cutting room floor, so to speak, for either of you? I'll go with Amanda and then Mike chime in.
Having never worked on an oral history project before, I didn't really know what to expect with this piece. So I don't know that I had expectations that were definitely not met in the process, but we considered a few different kinds of formats in terms of integrating all of the different voices before landing on the one that we did. And I really like how it came out. I really like kind of like this sort of handoff thing where it feels like almost like they're all in a room just pinging different pieces of the recollection at you. And that's kind of neat, and came out actually better than I expected.
What about you, Mike?
Some journalists like have sketch a narrative in their head before a story, and and I'm not faulting that, but that is not my approach. I usually go into something pretty blind, purposely, and then talk to people, and then build it based on what I end up learning and what people say. And so, I think we had just for like planning purposes, like a very rough outline, but I didn't have like a vision. I mean, that vision was just going to be predicated on what I learned and like, the most colorful memories that I could draw out of folks um and uh the history we dug into because we also did quite a bit of kind of combing through archives and stuff to stitch together, make sure we had all the facts right because people's memories aren't perfect at 30 years. So um, yeah, I was also happy with how it turned out. And
Mike did a great job, kind of. He did a really good job kind of doing these like little orientation type pieces between sections where like, okay, this is we're going to talk about getting the wolves from Canada. We're going to talk about the first wolves arriving in the wilderness of central Idaho and in the park. Then we're going to talk about the next round, and then we're going to talk about, kind of the aftermath stuff. He did a really good job fleshing all of that out to kind of help readers with wayfinding, if you will.
And what's been the feedback from readers on this article, if there's any that you can share?
I got one text from a reader who said he really enjoyed the story. Um, it's someone I know and like, but he said it could have been a little more balanced. This is a rancher, the guy who texted me, and yeah, just thought that it could have been more balanced. We could have more voices that perhaps were very wary of having wolves, and I think that's a fair criticism, 100%. Jim Magagna, we had someone kind of representing the Wyoming livestock industry, but took a quite level-headed view of things. I did see another anniversary story that's published where they interviewed the former Wyoming governor, Jim Geringer, and he described being basically blindsided by the feds. They didn't even give him the courtesy of telling him when they like brought wolves into the state of Wyoming, and that would have been a great voice. And we attempted to interview Jim, but he did not. To go back to your question earlier about if we struck out, he didn't call me back. So all I can do is try, and if he hears this, I'll be eager to talk to him in the future for anniversary stories. But those, I think that diversity of viewpoints would have made it rich, and there certainly is a big contingent of folks in the West who just didn't want wolves and still don't want wolves. So
what about you? What about you, Amanda? To
Yeah.
Mike Stephen's question.
It kind of runs the gamut. It's everything from great piece, but you should have incorporated X person, or all wolves should be shot. Like a one-line email. What do you do with that? And then one reader sent me like it was like a 2-page email, this really long email detailing a visit that she'd taken to Yellowstone and her, how she's followed wolf management for something like, 30 years from afar and has just been kind of thinking about the issue and remaining engaged in it. So that was kind of fun too. People sending in their own recollections. That was fun.
I had one guy email me who was, I think he had worked at Yellowstone kind of leading up to reintroduction and then retired like around that time. And he actually sent me these old clips. It was really cool of Bob Barbie, who was the Yellowstone superintendent. And I believe Bob is passed. Bob Barbie talking about his experience and actually talking about like how Dick Cheney handled it, like his negotiations with Dick Cheney. It's fascinating. It's really cool. It's like, man, I wish I would have got this before this story. And Dick Cheney was actually like very reasonable about it, and just told the superintendent like, I can't support this because my constituents, but was not over the top and reasonable about the whole thing.
Wow. I mean, as a history guy, Mike, what does because you were talking about digging in the archives before, what does that do for you as a reporter? I mean, is there a different level or a different like gear that you hit in yourself where you're like, oh, this is, physical history. This is something that happened, and revisiting, obviously you revisited it before when you did the 20th anniversary and 25th, but is there anything that you keep uncovering every time you go back that you didn't hit before? Like you said, the Dick Cheney thing, or something else this time around that you found like a little nugget that stuck out to you?
There are a few things. I mean, I ended up getting so much historical stuff that I wasn't able to use a fraction of it. I got a huge box full of clips from Renee Askins, who was the founder of the Wolf Fund, this former group in Jackson, and their whole mission was getting wolves reintroduced, and they closed once it happened. And she just, gave me like reams of old clips. But actually, what I ended up using most in the story was, so my colleague at WyoFile, Angus Thurmer, is in his early 70s, and so he was an editor at the Jackson Hole News at the time of reintroduction. And so, Angus has always loved the environment beat and wildlife. And they probably didn't even have an environment reporter back in those days, but Angus went up to Yellowstone during it all what was happening. So I was reading my colleagues' reporting from 30 years prior. And, it was Angus is a colorful writer, and, he was there on the ground laying eyes on wolves and talking to federal officials, and is cool to just dig into that from the mid-90s.
That's awesome. Amanda, because you're in the environmental space and you report on a lot of the stuff, like you said, that's close to you in your home state. What sort of hit you a little bit differently from this? Because as this story is out there now, and it's a little bit more of an anniversary, it's the anniversary piece, and maybe not so much tied to political or legislation or things like that, more about the story angle. What was something that you discovered while going through this, maybe for the first time as an anniversary piece? I don't know if you've done others, but this one in particular, because it's such a hot topic issue for most people out in the West. Was there something that you discovered along the way, like with Mike historically? What was some angle that you hit that resonated with you that's sort of stuck throughout this process?
Yeah. Well, one thing that was a little bit surprising actually is that it wasn't, I think a lawsuit from the Wyoming Stock Growers Association was widely anticipated, right? But evidently there was also a lawsuit brought by an environmental group or two. And I don't know which one that was, but there were also folks on the environmental side who felt like this particular reintroduction program was not the way to go with wolf management, and that kind of surprised me. And then something that really just kind of sticks with me still actually came from one of Mike's interviews with Suzanne Asha Stone. She said, Idaho is the worst place in the world to be a wolf. We have bounties on even pups in the den. They're being killed 365 days of the year using aerial gunning, snaring, trapping. This isn't what we envisioned when we brought wolves back. And she said basically that they wish they wouldn't have done the reintroduction in Idaho, given how things have developed since. And I think that's a really interesting takeaway.
Shocked when she said that.
Yeah. I mean, we've seen this with a lot of folks that I guess there's always the retrospective or the perspective, looking back, you can look back but you can't always look forward. So when you say, okay, what's this going to look like in 30 years when Mike and Amanda publish this piece, it's interesting to go back to that point, because as I'm sure you guys discussed with all of your interviewees, that this was the way to go. And there was a lot of stuff, and there's been books written about this, and we've had, Doug Smith and Carter Niemeyer and Suzanne Asha Stone and all these people who were there on the ground to describe the story, describe the climate at that point. It's interesting to look back and see this piece put together with many of those voices and recount something that, now 30 years in the future, I think people still question it to a degree. And they have, obviously their opinions and their ways to look at that. So for you to both take a step back from this, once you all hit publish, because I know when I produce anything or I cut a spot or I do whatever it is and I let it go, I'm like, okay, that's done. Was there any overall feeling from either of you once it was put together, all the T's were crossed, the I's were dotted? What was the overall feeling for either of you? I'll start with Mike and then go to Amanda. Once the piece was put together and all that work was done.
I was on vacation in Mexico when they kind of put it to bed, so I was trying not to think about things in the Northern Rockies, to be honest with you.
That's good though. So you were trying to relax. That's all good. Amanda, what about you?
Relief. When one of these big projects comes across the finish line, it's like a mix of relief and then kind of anxiousness. I'm always worried I'm going to get an email or a call or a couple emails. Hey, you got this wrong. Like that's, so there's always that first like 24 to 48 hour period is a little bit tentative. But overall, really, really proud of how it came out, really happy with the finished product. Like I said, it's just a unique project for I think both of our outlets, and I'm really pleased with how it came out.
So for both of you, now that I'm sure you're on to other projects, for both of you as collaborators in this piece, what do you hope that the readers from your prospective publications get from something like this? Is there an overarching theme that either of you have? Is it just another piece? What's kind of the thing that you guys are looking for as obviously this whole month is sort of celebrating the 30th anniversary. I know the actual date, Paws Around the Ground, was earlier this week, but what is sort of sitting with you as it's out there in the ether and people are going to be able to obviously have their opinions and their judgments about the issue one way or the other? Amanda, I'll start with you.
My great hope is that by looking at reintroduction through like a series of very personal lenses, that there will be more compassion for folks on a different side of the issue, that they'll have a deeper understanding of how much investment there is in a given position and what it's informed by, so they can have more civil, better conversations. That is my great hope.
What about you, Mike?
One thing that I think, like an insight that I gained myself that I would hope came across to readers, is just like how politically remarkable it is that it happened. Like just truly, with the states contesting it in 2025, like, man, I can't see the federal government coming in and doing something like this against the will of the states. Again, it's so controversial. It had been talked about for so long, and like that had actually happened, that like, they got a Democratic administration in and Congress appropriated money for it, like, is pretty remarkable. And it almost didn't happen. I mean, like, they fought, there was a fight until the very last moment, and those wolves were, stuck in transport cages. And and then Congress stripped the money away to do it the next year, which I didn't know until this project. So they had to fundraise and privately, there was a federal wolf reintroduction effort that was privately funded in 96, the second year. And so the fact that it's just kind of a remarkable moment, the fact that it happened. I just think that the odds were stacked against it happening, and that it did. And now there's this long legacy of it happening. I think is just kind of astonishing, and that was a big takeaway for me.
I have to agree with you too because I knew the bits and pieces, but to have it laid out in this story is a truly tremendous job by both of you. I think it was Doug Smith that said it, and I'll find it, and if I butcher it, I apologize, Doug, or anybody who's listening. But it was something like you said to the effect, we can't keep these wolves in here any longer. Like they were either in the crates themselves too long, or they were in the crates for 90 hours, or they were in the acclimation pens for however many days. And it's like, we can't keep, that's what it was. They were feeding, they were in the acclimation pens because of the soft release. And I think Doug Smith and Mike Phillips were like dragging carcasses to feed them and then water. And then as it got to springtime, they're like, we don't have any snow to drag this stuff up to. We have to let them go. because it's just, well, I think Mike Phillips is like, we're going to break our backs continuing to do this, to bring all this stuff up there. So it's, yeah, to both your points, it's such a tremendous accomplishment at a point in time where probably everything came together in a way, at least for that first year. And I think you're right, Mike. If those stopgaps were pulled the first year, who knows if people would have funded the next year. But the fact that it came together in that one moment for the first reintroduction to happen, the first batch of reintroduction, and then it was just the will of people to continue on to do this thing is fairly remarkable. At a time in our history where I guess there was a little bit more bipartisan or at least leniency within people at that moment in time. So for those who are listening, we're obviously going to have the link to the story itself. But Amanda, I'll start with you and then go to Mike. What's the best, or Amanda, I'll just go to you. What's the best place for people to find this story? Is it both on WyoFile and Montana Free Press, and how can they find it?
Yeah. We have it on both sites. It's also on another Greater Yellowstone ecosystem kind of outlet called Mountain Journal. So it can be found on all three of those. And if you type in Year of the Wolves into your Google bar, it should point you towards the WyoFile piece, and then also Montana Free Press. And if you go, the layouts are a little bit different between the sites, but something that's kind of fun on the WyoFile side is you can actually play some of the actual audio clips from the interview. And sometimes we publish each other's stuff on occasion, right? Because both of our outlets make our stories available to other outlets to republish. So
yeah, I think anybody who's listening to any free publication that is free or is, a nonprofit is, these are, especially WyoFile, and I know Montana Free Press, this is getting news from your actual state, from people who live in the state that you live in, which I know I said that twice, but it's on the ground reporting from people who actually live there. And so that's very valuable and extremely important. I used to work in local news when I was younger, and it's really big for people to have that connection with the folks that are reporting this. And it's not just a big outlet swooping in, doing a story and leaving. So if you can donate to either WyoFile or Montana Free Press, please do that so that they can continue doing stories like these and beyond. Amanda, since this is your first time on our podcast, I'll ask you the question that I asked Mike a couple of times. But when you hear the word wolf, what's the thing that comes to your mind?
Ooh, it's really more of an image. Like I kind of just see an image. I see a wolf in a snowy landscape, maybe howling. But I think, it's just wildness, right? And that's a little bit similar to something that Mike Phillips said in one of my interviews. He said, the thing that he likes about wolves is that they make a landscape worthy of his attention. You're just like, I don't know, just a different component. So, I think of wild spaces when I think of wolves.
Awesome. It's tremendous. Mike Koshmrl, Amanda Eggert, thank you both so much for putting this piece together, for the collaboration, and for putting it out to the public. And thank you for your time. It's really been great to speak to you guys about the ins and outs of the story and putting something like this together that takes months of research and work to come out with this awesome final product. So thank you both for talking with Stephen and I and letting people get a little insight as to what happened. So thank you both.
Thanks, John.
Yeah, thanks for having us on.
No problem, guys. Hang tight while we sign off. How's to you all out there? We'll be with you next time. Bye, everybody. Looking for more information about Wolf Connection or the podcast? Please visit our website at wolfconnection.org, where you can donate, sponsor a wolf, or become a volunteer.